Welcome back, everybody, and we're now going to go to the panel discussion, a chance for you to ask any questions in relation to what you've just heard in the previous session. First of all, I'd just like to, you have met Johanna and Paul, who've presented already, but just to welcome to the panel discussion Judge Anne Ryan. You'll have met, I would have introduced the three members who are on the advisory group also, and that's Judge Anne Ryan, Professor Mary Cannon and Joe O'Neill, who are on the advisory group working with us in the process throughout. So I'd like to welcome them with Paul and Johanna. Just two quick things from me before, just so you understand how we're taking the questions. I'm aiming to get questions from all of the tables as best we can. Conscious in the last session, for example, table 7 and 12, we haven't got to, but again, we'll mix this through each session. If any of you has any particular concerns that you had a good questions, which they all are, it hasn't been answered, just to say the ones that we don't get to in these open sessions, we will be responding to them and it'll be on the site. So you'll see responses to all of the questions raised. So just bear with us, we're trying to get the mix, but we'll respond to all of the questions raised and they'll be up there for your review. So on that basis, can I just go straight into a question which I have from, I'll try to get one from table 7 straight away. Yeah, sorry, table 7, if I can go to Adrian.
Hi, Paul. A couple of times we mentioned the Drug Act of 1977. The table was wondering to what extent that act was updated or amended. We were just saying it doesn't seem that relevant from 1977. Maybe we should be calling things like Drug Act 2020 or 2023.
And one of the areas, Carl will come in, just one of the areas where you will have the opportunity is to, we have a very clear mandate in terms of reference to look at the policy and current policies and to suggest where things need to be changed. But I'll just give Carl a chance.
Yes, so the reference to 1977 is when the legislation was first enacted. That's not to say nothing has changed since 1977. So there are a series of changes made to the Act and to the schedules of the Act through statutory instruments and so on. So there is ongoing updating of that Act, but the reference to 1977 is the original year that it was enacted.
Thanks for that again. And can I go to table 3? Sorry, I'm just trying to again mix it. Okay, table 3, Kerry, please.
I was just in terms of the presentation that Professor Ivers gave about the 4 groups and how ultimately, when we think about drug users, that everybody is ultimately at risk to some extent of addiction and death. Just, did you have maybe the second part of that, what the relative risks are, and if there was any statistical data in terms of each of the groups, like whether that was a 1 in 10, a 1 in 1,000, or 1 in 1,000,000?
Again, I'm going to stick to the fact that it will depend on the person, it will depend on the drug, and it will depend on the context. So it's when it comes to unregulated drugs like, let's say, pills or powders that you don't quite know what you're taking, it is a case of each time you take something like that, you're taking a risk. We can't go down because to the point of 1 in every 10 times. Unfortunately, I mean, that would be study dependent and would be based on batches of that drugs. Drugs are that inconsistent, unfortunately. But I suppose I don't have them to hand now, but when we talk about so not the immediate risk to death, but the long-term risk to death, and we talk about other ailments and morbidities, we can look at risk in terms of cancer and things like that. Is that what your question's about?
No, it's just when you had the 4 different groups and the way it was presented, it looked like ultimately anyone who takes drugs ultimately is at risk of addiction and death. And I think the way you were presenting it was a way to break down stigmatism, to show that like addiction is not about moral judgment or that way that it can come to any of our doors. But it also looked at an idea of like drugs are bad because drugs ultimately lead to addiction and death. So I was just interested in like the statistical data there.
Okay.
In terms of drug use among different categories of people. So if you did have it, great. I'd be really interested in seeing the rest of the presentation and the study. But if the data isn't there, that's fine.
Well, I don't have absolute data now, but I suppose just to clarify a point, I wasn't saying that all drug use ultimately leads to. I was trying to paint a picture of risk, and I suppose an earlier statistic I talked about in terms of a broader population is that when we look at people who use drugs, almost 90% of people use a drug and transition out of that drug use. Mm-hmm. When we're looking at risk to dependence and addiction, we're generally talking about a 10%. Does that satisfy the question?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes.
And
so I apologise for that confusion.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that 10% is across all 4 groups.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Do you want a quick response? I just want to move on.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank
Johanna.
you.
Well, I suppose I was presenting 4 groups in terms of immediate and long-term risk, and then the non-problematic and the clinical group are 2 distinct groups. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Kerry, and I was particularly interested in that slide, as I said earlier on. I thought it was really good, and thanks for asking the question there. Can I go to Adele on table 12, please? And this might be a question for Paul, I think, but go ahead, Adele. Yeah.
Hey, just thank you, Paul and Joanna, for those presentations. They were really powerful. We were just wondering, you talked about the monitoring in the EU, or the EU monitors the drugs that come in, about 600, I think you said. We were just wondering, what does that involve?
Okay, I mean, we monitor everything we can monitor. And the thing about drug problems and drug use is it's a hidden, stigmatized behavior, as Joanne's saying. So it's difficult to measure accurately, so we have to use indirect indicators. When the 600, these are new uncontrolled substances. So each, we have something called the EU Early Warning System on new psychoactive substances. All member states participate in that. And if a member state finds a new substance that they haven't seen before, they'll report it to us. We will ask other member states if they've seen that. We'll put out an alert. And the idea really is to kind of share information between countries so that we're all better prepared by the what's happening in one country. Because if you see something in Ireland, it could be a few weeks later you could see that in Germany, you could see it in Greece. So, or likewise, you might see something in Estonia, and then later it could be a problem in Ireland. So it's about sharing information, and it's based on detections of new substances through national early warning systems. And I know there's an early warning system in Ireland, and I know I was talking earlier to colleagues here that there's ideas to strengthen that in the future, and I think that's a really good idea, given just this complexity and diversity we face these days.
Thank you, Paul. And if I can go to James on table 9, I think Eva may have a question that I would hope might be addressed by Judge Anne Ryan. So trying to get a mix here. James, please.
Thank you, Chair. Question for Paul. He put up a slide there with an example of test tubes, and you mentioned a new drug or newer type drugs was 2 mgs, and the equivalent was 200 in cocaine. And you alluded to it being it's possible to post it around the world. The authorities will have no ability to stop that. Their only alternative will probably be legalisation, to put in an alternative to the illegal one. Is that the situation we're facing?
Sorry, and apologies, James. Yeah, I misinterpreted your question, so we'll ask Paul to answer. But Judge Ryan might have just the whole issue of transportation as well, so maybe.
I think,
Sir Paul.
I mean, it's a real challenge, yeah. In the past, think about heroin. You needed to grow opium, you needed to convert that in hidden factories, you needed then to guard that crop, and you had a large volume plant-based material, and you had to take it across borders. If you think of something like fentanyl, and fentanyl is the synthetic opiates now causing terrible problems in North America and Canada. And there that can be produced in labs there, it's highly potent, and very small packages it's highly profitable for organised crime groups to produce, and very small packages can represent hundreds of thousands of street doses. And it's also very difficult to divide up safely, because if that drug is even very, very small mistakes in terms of cutting that substance means someone can be exposed to a fatal dose much more easily than with bigger, larger volume plant-based materials. So I think it is a real challenge for the future, and we're seeing a lot of issues now around synthetic drug production, which really changes the game a little bit in terms of the ability of the drug market to produce things in ways that are going to be much more difficult to interdict in the future than they are now, where you need large areas or outside growing areas where you grow plant-based materials, and you have to convert that. You have laboratories somewhere in that country and then export them. So I do think it represents a real challenge for the future.
Is that newer type drug a thing of today or the future, or is it, how available is it now, or is this going on as we speak?
Well, we're not seeing a lot of fentanyl yet in the EU. We're seeing a little bit, and it comes in. It has been associated with outbreaks of deaths and poisoning. In North America, I think you've probably seen, and maybe followed it on, there's been documentaries about it, how they had a pharmaceutical opiate problem that got then replaced with a heroin problem, and now that's been taken over by synthetic fentanyls, and that's resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths, and actually really having a profound impact on overall public health at the population level. So I think we can't be complacent about this. We're certainly seeing, in terms of some of the newer drugs, the synthetic cannabinoids are again a problem here, because a very small packages can represent very large volumes of potential street drug. And I think that's the trouble we're wrestling a bit. What we've seen it more in terms of the synthetic cannabinoids and those sorts of substances, but we've seen a little bit in terms of synthetic opioids. At the same time, what we've seen is actually the heroin problem appears fairly stable. We've got quite still high supply of heroin from Afghanistan. That might change with what's happening with the Taliban at the moment. We don't know. So I certainly would say it's something we can't be complacent about for the future. But we're certainly seeing it in terms of synthetics becoming much more important as a class of drugs than they used to be. And that was the point I was trying to make.
Thank you,
Thank
Paul.
you.
And feel free to come in if you have any particular comments. I interpret as...
Not really, Paul. I mean, all I would say perhaps is that the Gardaí have a dreadfully difficult job trying to prevent the access of drugs into the country. But I think it's for you, the Assembly, to deal with the next point you were raising about whether legalisation is the answer to that. And I would hope at the end of the few months that you've spent together that you'll be able to come up with the solutions, perhaps, or recommendations.
Thank you, Anne. No pressure. Can I ask Jack on table 10, please, as a question, and just ask the panel to list because it might be for one or two.
Hi, I had a question. Would education be more effective than prohibition? So education, anything from the nuances and risks of drugs, whether it's, practicing good mental health and mindfulness. And if I could use an example where prohibition in the United States in the 30s, alcohol was prohibited, and even to such an extreme extent that the law enforcement would poison alcohol to try and scare people away from it, but of course they still drank alcohol, and the prohibition fell through. But we still educate people today on the risks and drinking responsibly, so should education be practiced more instead of prohibition? Would it be more effective?
Thanks, Jack, and a great question, and I know all of the panel will have a view on this one. I might just ask Mary first of all, please, if that's okay, Mary.
Oh yeah, that's hi. That's a very interesting question. I suppose I would feel that the two you could be having unintended consequences by making drug use more acceptable, in that the education aspect would then be affected, because young people would then, they're heavily influenced by what's going on in society, by their parents, by their peers, and all the education in the world won't probably make much of a difference if society is heading in the opposite direction, and if society makes the decision to make drug use more normalised, young people will pick up on that. For instance, with seatbelts and speeding, you can have all the public education you like. People will still speed. You need to put the seatbelts in place, the traffic laws in place to make sure that the roads are safe. So I don't think education by itself is the answer here. But yeah, I agree, it definitely has a place.
And I'm just conscious this does touch on some of the many views that we'll hear as well. So, on the panel, can I just ask Joe, maybe from the local Drugs and Alcohol Task Force, if he's any experience or views on that one?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important point, and I probably just looked at the programme earlier on that Cathal had set out. It will be something that we'll be talking about at previous sessions as to what the response to the problem is, and it's not just about treatment or rehabilitation, it's about prevention and early intervention, because this starts at a very young age, and even I picked that up even what Joanna was saying about the predisposition that people might have and their environment they grew up in. So education in the broader sense will have a role. Now, if you're talking about education, people are speaking about the safe way of using drugs. I think that's probably quite a tall order in terms of the fact, because as Joanna's pointed out and Mary said, it's all about risk, and there's going to be a degree of risk. But the question, I think the larger challenge about prevention is to try and say, well, let's not talk about the drugs, let's talk about the people. And why is it that certain people are more predisposed, if you like, to using drugs than others? And there are various things going on around the world that we can learn from. I think it's something that we're working on at the moment. None of them are perfect. There's no perfect solution to this. But there's a lot of work going on in places like Iceland, where they're looking at focus particularly on young people and if you like, what you might call them, to give them more protective activities. So that this famous thing about people are saying, we have nothing to do in our neighbourhood, we're hanging around street corners at night. And it's trying to counter that to some degree, and give some people would probably do is we can identify just out of boredom, I'll try something different, or a guy showed me how this stuff when I tried it or whatever else. But so that's the wider sense of being educated. But I think it is a big part of the prevention, in terms of trying to lessen, I suppose, the predisposition to get into a situation where you become dependent or something like that very quickly.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to try to keep things moving, and there's a question by Joanne on table 11. It might be for Johanna, please.
Thank you. This is the question from our table for Professor Ivers. Joanna, what would you describe as the benefits of drug use?
Well, sorry. When we talk about benefits, really it's down to the individual. So identifying the benefits of drug use is really crucial, because if you're trying to intervene with someone, whether it's at a population level, at a GP practice, and you're trying to move someone from one bottle of wine or 2 bottles of wine to 1, or in addiction-specific services where you're trying to get somebody to manage their drug use, identifying what a person is gaining or benefiting from is really your point of intervention, because you're trying to replicate what it is that they're getting from that. And again, not to fudge an answer, that will be dependent on the person. So as I say, people use drugs because they feel good, they might be self-medicating, they're trying to feel a different way. When you identify whatever that benefit is, that's where your intervention is. And whether that's from, if we take Sharon, who had low-level risk, she identified it as being relaxing. So is there another way to tap into that? Or, as I pointed out, is that just okay, it's not causing her consequence, and should it be left there? So I suppose the point of benefits is a way of kind of tapping into what a person is getting from using a drug.
Thank you.
Sorry, and a great question again. Anne, if you don't mind me just coming to you again, from your experience in the drug court and courts in general, how do you, or have you ever had to come to those kind of judgments in terms of?
No, never. Never. I suppose, to be honest, the people who unfortunately would have appeared before me in the drug court, you know, it's the end point where the criminal justice system has now been reached and it has to be dealt with. And the drug court gave people that chance to be able to go through a programme and come out the other end, hopefully free of, many of them free of drugs completely, but others, you know, maybe have managed halfway through. But the programme is such that, linking into what that question about the education as well, the programme is so well organised from the point of view of the treatment end of things and the education end of things, that giving people who have been through addiction and who have been through then, as a result of their addiction, ending up in the courts, people who've been through all of that, their dignity is gone, their self-esteem is gone. They're really at the bottom of the pile, if you like, in many ways, and they're facing custody. And our way of dealing with it was, custody is not going to help them. We need to go through a different programme. And the education programme that was run was absolutely first class. It meant that people who were illiterate began to write. People who had given up education at primary level went on and did their FETACs. People went to college, and suddenly this person that had no self-esteem could stand up and do a PowerPoint presentation for us. I mean, it's just quite incredible what education can do. And I think in that way, it fills a huge gap. It's not education just about the drugs. It's education to give the person back a sense of identity, of dignity, of where they're coming from. And because they get more power in themselves to do something like that, then they're in a better position to say no to things that they know are not going to be positive in their lives. I mean, I could go on and on. Sorry, Paul, maybe.
No,
but that,
no,
you know,
and
I do think it's terribly important. Thank you.
And I'm really anxious that, certainly in the next assembly, that we do get some time, or the assembly that Anne is available for, that we get some time for Anne to outline what she has been doing through her career, just in terms of a very innovative way of looking at a very challenging issue. So thanks, Anne. You can see it was well appreciated.
Thank you.
Table 8, can I just go to Alana, please?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the very informative presentations. They've been really interesting. I suppose the question we had here is, if a certain drug was to be legalised, or a portion of a drug, or a portion of a synthetic drug, how and where would that drug be sourced from? And can we regulate that? Can we fund the regulation of that?
Thanks. And can I go maybe to Paul in the first instance on that one? Paul?
Not me, another Paul.
Paul, hard luck, you're in.
Yes, I mean, that's a big question.
I hope you were listening.
I think one of the... It's a complicated... one of the issues is, I think there's a lot of concerns that people use substances that they don't know what they're consuming. Many of the problems come through mixtures. We know, for instance, that benzodiazepines, when you mix them with opiates or you mix them with alcohol, is more damaging than using individually, and a lot of drug users use things in combination. Or they might be using things like cannabis, thinking they're smoking cannabis, and adding synthetic cannabis, but in fact they're consuming synthetic cannabis, cannabinoids, which can be very toxic. So there is real issues about poor quality mixtures and using unregulated, unknown substances. And you see different approaches to countries trying to do that, including some countries now. They provide drug testing services where they try and inform people if there's toxic chemicals involved, more toxic chemicals, sorry, or different things than they think that they're consuming. But it's a complicated issue because a lot of the issues, pure drugs are dangerous. And often it's a dose effect. So if you take a lot of an opiate, if you take a sufficient amount, it will kill you. And if it's a pure opiate, it will kill you just as much as if it's an unpure opiate. And one of the problems is making, I think they tried this in New Zealand, where they wanted to produce sort of NPS substances and make them legally available. The problem is the dose problem, which is if you take a very small amount of a pure substance, the risks are much lower than if you take a large amount. But how do you stop people who consume substances tend to take bigger and bigger doses? And so it's really, I think there is an issue there about the fact that you have a lot of contamination into the supply chain in the illicit drug market, and that clearly causes problems and it clearly results in toxic events. But I don't think at the same time simply making pure substances available will solve all the problems associated with drugs and consumption. So it's a complicated one to address.
Can I just ask Johanna, I mean, the question was, it does touch on two big issues, which is legislation and regulation, and, you know, having the legislation doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. So have you any views just about, you know, if there's legislation change or regulation change, what protections did that give?
So if we regulate drugs and I don't understand the question, sorry.
Maybe if you want to read it again, but I just think it touches on two big issues. Ilana.
Yes, so we're talking about decriminalising something here.
Yeah.
So a portion of a drug or a synthetic portion of a drug. How would we possibly regulate that? Is it through testing here, testing at source? What if the source is illegal? Do we have to find legalised sources? How do we even go about it? And can we fund it is the biggest question. You probably won't know the funding.
No, I don't have the funding. I kind of feel a bit out of my depth with that one. I don't know that I know the answer, sorry.
Yeah. No, I actually the reason I want to take it was because I think it now touches on three areas. You brought another one in. Legislation, criminalisation, or decriminalisation, and regulation. So let's just put on hold. We'll certainly respond to this, but I think it is one that's going to be a theme throughout this, and particularly we will come to the Assembly meeting in where we'll have some of the legal expertise coming in with us as well. But I know many of your questions are actually operational. How would you control it after it's legalised? So I understand where you're coming from, but let's just put on hold for now, which gets to the heart of all of this. But too early in the exam question, just right now, is my answer to that one. Can I just say, we do have a couple of minutes left, so we're tight, but I have time for another question. And again, it comes back to the education issue, but kind of anxious to take it again. So Luminita on table 15.
Hello everybody, and thank you for the lovely two presentations. Our question was actually partially answered because it was raised before by table 10, I think. So the question is, could we do more to prevent so we have less to criminalize? And that was partly through education. What is done at present in schools to educate people to not use drugs? Can we do more to educate young people?
Yeah. Apologies, and sorry for cutting you off. Thank you. And I might just ask Mary again to come in just on the whole education piece. And then just to say it is something that we'll be coming back to with specific presentations on the education stuff. Mary?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. Of course, we should be doing more in schools. I think the Department of Education are developing programs, but they're not. I suppose they're not being rolled out, I suppose, the way they should be. That's my impression about this, and I think we could look into that. It's an issue that I think teachers don't feel comfortable tackling. So perhaps we need another way to get the education into the schools rather than expecting the teachers to do this on top of their normal job. People with lived experience developing schools is one thing that used to be used. Of course, we have to be very careful about that and protect people from over sharing and of their experiences. I think we need to look at countries in terms of prevention. That's one thing I do feel very passionately about, and I think we need to look at countries that seem to be doing it well. And Joe mentioned Iceland. This is one country where drug use and alcohol use in young people is going down. We need to see what's happening in Iceland. Unfortunately, most of the countries, Europe, as Paul mentioned, we're doing okay in general. Like, for instance, with cannabis use, about 1% of our young people in Europe use cannabis on a daily basis. Now, if we look at the United States and Canada, we're talking about 10%. Now, this is young people who use drugs on a use cannabis on a daily basis. And to get back to the First Lady's question, they will have a 1 in 3 risk of addiction. Really high in young people because of the way their brains are developing. So I think I don't think we should be looking to countries that are going the wrong direction. We should be looking at countries that are going the right direction in terms of prevention. So thank you. Do you want to come in on that? Or?
Thank you. We are at 1 o'clock, but if I could just have one last quick fire question, but I think it's important, and I'll ask Johanna maybe to respond to this one. So Tom on table 6, please.
Professor Ives, in your talk you were talking about why people use. And I'm wondering, so you gave 2 reasons, but I'm wondering if there's any evidence about predisposition genetically to addiction. And if so, is there a way to measure how common that is in a particular population group? So say Ireland versus Portugal, because that may be relevant in the discussion talking about the decriminalization.
So, yeah, there is studies looking at predisposition and risk to addiction for sure. Whether or not we could, they're relatively small and relatively expensive, so that's why they're small and infrequent. Can we then compare them to other countries? You'd have to know what you're talking about in terms of the study. And again, I would just bring you back to the point of, are we comparing like with like? So is it the same type of drug in the same circumstances with the same level of risk or the same level of benefit to the person? So you'd have to be clear on your parameters of comparison.
Okay, so look, I'm conscious now we're standing before your lunch, which I think you've all well earned at this stage. Can I just ask, as you break for lunch, first of all, to thank the panel for giving some really good presentations.